Welcome back to Magic in the Noise. Today we're going to talk about something secret, controversial, and something that no one else has really been talking about very much. Can you shield a target from remote viewers? And what we found is the answer is yes, you can.
Yes, you can, Sasha. And this was discussed and discovered within a 2002 research paper by Persinger. And he worked with Ingo Swann, which was very interesting. And his initial desire was to create what he called a transponder for the target. He actually wanted to make it easier for Ingo to see the target, and he actually did the opposite.
In this experiment, what they did was they put the target in an envelope and then they exposed the envelope to a complex but weak magnetic field that had a fractal-like pattern to it. And the idea was that by embedding the pattern of the target into this magnetic field, that Ingo would find it easier to access the data. So essentially, they set it up so that there were two conditions for each computer system. In the one condition, they were sending a sine wave-like pattern through DOS and Windows. Under DOS, it didn't make a difference, but with Windows, there was a shielding effect. And then they send out a more complex Fibonacci spiral signal as the waveform. The main difference, it sounds like, is that DOS is sending the frequencies on 3 bands, whereas Windows, the frequency is moving through the full spectrum available, and that seems to be the problem.
It's interesting because if you look at the table of the information on a scale of 0 to 10, how easy was it for Ingo to see the information? When he did it in a normal setting with like none of this stuff set up, it was essentially an 8. But when he tried to do it, when the envelope was magnetized, the field around it by Windows, it actually dropped to a 0 and a 1, which is like, wow. So when we think about this as a process, one of the things, of course, that comes to mind immediately is, Sasha, what do you think that means for Windows itself in relationship to psychic capability and data harvesting?
You know, it makes me think about the fact that we typically keep our targets on our computers these days. We very rarely just write them in a book and leave them in our notepad, more often than not, because we send it to each other for feedback, things like that, even just for better file storage. I have a bad habit now, I'm realizing, of putting my targets in a Word document or in a PDF. That's just the one issue, which is when we're creating targets for each other and we're using Microsoft Windows, then we're essentially shielding the targets that we're creating for each other. But there is a deeper implications to it, wouldn't you say, in terms of the widespread use of Windows?
Was this intentional for Windows? Was this something that Windows was created before this experiment? This experiment with Ingo was in 2002. Windows, of course, is much older than that. When it was created in the 90s, roughly, from my recollection, I would say that the remote viewing program was already exposed. Does that mean that if the government wanted to protect their data from remote viewers?
If the study with Persinger and Ingo was published and publicly available, it makes me think that the military probably did similar tests, but maybe a decade or so earlier. And so I don't think it's too far-fetched to wonder, is part of the reason why Windows is broadcasting on every possible frequency, because it helps to disrupt our own consciousness, our consciousness field, not just for remote viewing, but even just for our own thoughts. We're embedded in a world where there are computers all around us.
So based on this knowledge and information, then, if it is a real issue, as a remote viewer, what are some of the things that we should actually be thinking about in terms of remote viewing and tasking?
I think this is where the role of the remote viewer really comes into play in a way that people don't often talk about either. They assume that the tasker has set the queue and their job is just to remote view whatever the tasker has set forth. But there's a lot more responsibility that a good remote viewer needs to take. And one of those is to establish for themselves what are the boundaries of the data, where are they going to look for the data, what kind of information about the target they want to bring back, any lapses or gaps in the tasking that they want to either work around or fill. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is a good point. I've been a beginner to advanced. I've gone through the process. And initially, when you're a viewer, you're just trying to understand, does this work? You're not really thinking about these kinds of ideas. You're just focused on trying to get the protocols down, pull the data, right? But as you get more advanced, if you think about it a little deeper, you start to realize that you can have a responsibility within this process, and that you could do this through a process of self-tasking. So when we normally kind of go to the target, the tasker, like you said, it could be literally anything. Now they've isolated to one thing. That's great. The individual's interests essentially sort of then drive the data collection from that point forward, which means this is partially why I think you need more of a team. Like some of this could be cleaned up if you had more strategic kind of tasking, essentially. But it's like, I'm grabbing the candy over here and you don't like candy, so you're grabbing the vegetables over there, right? And so we're just kind of like all over the place. And one of the ways that you can take a role of responsibility within this as a viewer is to actually self-task yourself individual cues associated with a target.
And that way, the individual remote viewer can say, okay, I'm going to get the candy because that's shiny and more interesting for me. But then I'm going to self task myself and say, regardless of whether the original tasking is asking me to go look at this, I'm going to task myself to go look at that because I suspect that there's something over there that's relevant or important for the target. And so I want to make sure that I cover that. And I think that the only way that we can move forward as a remote viewing community and have slightly less reliance on teams, because it can be hard to find a remote viewing team to work with, is to start tasking ourselves to get that all the data that you need.
Yeah, and Sasha and I work through experience. We've actually tested some of these things and they do work in terms of self-tasking cues. We think about it in relationship to this idea of the target possibly being shielded and nobody knows that, right? If this is a concern, you could actually write down on your piece of paper when you're going to do the remote viewing data, you write your target number, right? And then you can start to create directives for yourself. So Sasha, with the experiment in the lab and they have a magnetic field around the envelope and the envelope has the answer, is that the only way that you can get the answer, or are there other ways you can get the answer?
Well, that's the thing. There's so many other ways you can get the answer. You could, instead of going to the envelope to get the data to find the target, you could go to the tasker's mind, in this case, Persinger's mind. Or you could go to the data stream that exists independently of envelopes and pieces of paper. You could go within you, because I believe that there's some kind of I don't know if it's a holographic version of reality within us that's constantly updated, so it's always matching external reality, but it's a slightly different version of it, and it's our version of it. And so it's just another opportunity to get data that's pure from any kind of shielding like that.
This is exactly the point that I'm trying to make, is that you could write directives that have a higher probability of bypassing these kinds of issues, even if they do exist. Ooh, I'm going to use a scary word. If we want to call it the mind of God, if you want to call it a simulation, you can use whatever terms you want to use that are comfortable for you. But at some level, that data exists and you cannot hide it from itself. This is a collective of information that God is not ignorant of some shielded envelope, right? Because it's in the person's mind that wrote it. It's in the actual, atoms that exist within the space, right, of the envelope. It's all a reflection of a matrix type of system. It's all there. So again, yes, I believe that you can use these target cues to bypass shielding in that way. But we can also use it in other ways which is sort of the ways that Sasha and I have used it in order to produce more productive remote viewing data.
Yes, and we've tried these things work, and it's mostly to be able to get more data, get more accurate data, more relevant data. I think that's a really big one. I'll often use the self-tasking of gather relevant data so that I don't go off describing something that's interesting to me, but really it doesn't have much to do for the tasker. It's not really important. Precision of the data that you're collecting, verifiable data, things, whether it's new to the tasker or it's new to me. These are all the kinds of things that you can build into your self-tasking when you're working a session that we've built into our self-taskings, and we found that they work.
It's like the tasker is the boss. The boss says, hey, can you take care of this? And then you decide how you're going to take care of that job. And in this case, without any self-tasking, to me, it's a little bit more like this exploratory, kind of laid back, sort of chill attitude where you're just kind of like whatever kind of meets your fancy, you're just grabbing what you can and pull down, right? This approach is more of a professional level kind of mindset where you're like, hey, I actually want to do something that's valuable. It's not about me having the experience. It's about me actually pulling data that has real value to the tasker, or data that is 100% verifiable so that I know that I'm remote viewing things things of that nature. And there's a whole list of potential things that you could think about in association with self-tasking. For example, Sasha, what are your thoughts on the possibility of having a single tasker, and then what if that tasker doesn't know that there are other people injecting unwanted cues onto that target that they've created? As an example, I'm just saying they could come in many forms, but if you had a big group system and you had multiple people in the chain of custody that could touch that target, some of them could just add information and the original tasker wouldn't know, the remote viewer wouldn't know. Then what is the remote viewer focusing on when they look at that target? Are they focusing on the tasker's target cue? Are they focusing on the secondary person? What's happening with that?
What you're asking is a more general and important question, which is, can something lead a remote viewing group into a false conclusion? Can something make them deviate and come up with something bad? So we've been aware of that for a long time. We found out that some elements within the intelligence community, when they wanted to corrupt a project that we were doing, that especially one that had a public audience, they would use the same target coordinates that we use, the 8 numbers. Those are 8 numbers that remote viewers have to write down to start their sessions for other projects that they would give their remote viewers. So you'd have a bunch of intelligence community remote viewers using the same numbers for one target, and our remote viewers got used to the idea of going out in a flock, like a flock of birds, to a thing, and that number was going towards something, and they saw essentially the flock, or a flock, of remote viewers going to a different target. And it was a way to actually lead the remote viewers off target to something else. And the intelligence community became good at being able to distort what the actual target was. So what we did to counteract that is since we knew that the analyst thoughts are the things that are the most important for creating the target, we let the remote viewers pick their own target coordinates.
We stopped using the numbers.
We stopped using one set of numbers for each target. So everybody has different numbers. So there isn't that type of link that we can do.
So how would you deal with that, Sasha?
So that's the thing. That's where the self-queuing is so important, so that it doesn't matter if there are problems in the chain of custody. It doesn't matter if there are people maybe hijacking your target a little bit because your results are going to be public, so they want to harvest their own data, those kinds of situations. You can task it so that you're only going to gather information that's being requested by the initial original tasker, and nothing else, nothing outside of that. One of the things I wanted to also bring up is this is a way to provide data that can solve a problem. This is something that Ed Dames brought up in our interview with him. The CRV, the way he described it, was more of a training tool, and that it wasn't meant to solve problems. And what we're doing is developing techniques and methods to be able to use remote viewing to solve problems. That's what he's done as well with his geolock system, things like that, and a number of different modules for problem solving. And that's where that comes in as well, is you want to be able to solve a problem without contamination from other people who might inject their own data gathering or distractions or anything like that in the target that you're being given.
We are constantly striving to try to create a better remote viewing product. And in terms of groups, I don't believe that a group is required to do remote viewing. It's something that Sasha and I talk about frequently, is that we believe there are solutions, knowledge, protocols, things of that nature, tools, whatever you want to call it. And we can get to a point where a single individual will consistently produce the data that is needed to solve a problem, not an entire group. And in the context of that concept, the idea of self-tasking is one of the components that helps.
Yes, and I think that goes hand in hand with the idea that as a remote viewer, at a certain point, you're no longer just trying to prove target contact. Now you're trying to do something above and beyond that. You're trying to solve the problem, bring back new information, elucidate, solve a mystery, find something, whatever it is you're trying to do. it's not just proving target contact. And I think you have to have that mindset when you go into your session, that this isn't just, did I hit the target? This is, how much information can I bring back? And it's a challenge, it's an adventure, and it should be exciting. It should spark your curiosity, so that you're not just looking to say, oh, I described, the table that's sitting in a room in Egypt. No, tell me so much more, because you're there, you have access, you're on a signal line. So go and explore and bring back as much as you can. I think that's what I see, that something in our work that I think we both prioritize. And I'm not sure if that's something that's taught to people to really pursue it in that way.
So I hope this video has provided stimulation of thought, new ideas, research areas that you can go look up. And if somebody tells you that remote viewing can't be shielded against, you can say, well, that's not actually true. It's already been proven to a degree. And there's probably more of it that's actually being done by other organizations that we just aren't necessarily aware of. But we now have hopefully some ideas on how to deal with that.
But also think about maybe not only storing your documents on Windows computers. Maybe have a notepad where you keep your tasking documents.
If you do the experiments, like, hey, I've done target cues written for remote viewers on the computer, and I've heard this conversation, and now you got me thinking. And I don't know if it's true, but let me test it. So you start actually applying this on paper, and you find that your results of your viewers go up. Let us know.
Please feel free to leave comments down below, and we will be looking at them and replying.
So until next time.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.